The rifle barrel caught the dying light like a promise she'd been carrying for weeks. Miriam's voice cracked against the Colorado wind, each word a prayer wrapped in desperation. "Kill me before they come back." But Silas Boone had seen too much death to grant that mercy to someone whose eyes still held fragments of tomorrow. In the foothills where Union and Confederate ghosts walked the same trails, two broken souls would discover that sometimes salvation comes not from the bullet, but from the hand that refuses to pull the trigger. Subscribe to witness how defiance becomes the first word of freedom. The mountain air tasted of snow and secrets when Silas Boone first heard the sobbing. It drifted through the pine needles like smoke from a dying fire, thin and desperate, cutting through the evening silence that had settled over the Colorado foothills. He'd been tracking Confederate scouts for 3 days, his boots worn thin against the rocky terrain, his mind heavy with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. The war had followed him here, to this remote outpost, where Union soldiers pretended the world made sense, where orders came clean and enemies wore the right colors. But the sobbing belonged to neither army. It belonged to something broken, something that made his chest tighten with recognition. He found her crumpled against a boulder like discarded cloth, her dress torn and stained with mud and blood that wasn't entirely her own. Miriam Clark, though he wouldn't know her name for hours yet, looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much of hell to fear one more devil. Her dark skin bore the marks of rope and rough hands, her hair matted with pine needles and desperation. When she saw his Union blue, something flickered across her face. Not hope, but something more dangerous. Relief, the kind that came before the final surrender. She raised her chin, exposing the raw marks around her throat, and spoke words that would haunt his dreams for years to come. "Kill me before they come back," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of every mile she'd run, every prayer she'd whispered to an empty sky. "Please, I won't go back to that place." Her hands trembled as she gestured toward the south, toward whatever hell had spit her out into these mountains. Silas felt his rifle grow heavy in his hands, felt the familiar weight of decision pressing against his ribs like a stone. He'd killed men before, boys really, who'd worn grey instead of blue, who'd died calling for their mothers in languages he didn't understand. But this was different. This was mercy wearing the face of murder, and he'd learned long ago that mercy was the most dangerous weapon of all. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching storm and something else. Horses, leather, the metallic tang of men who'd ridden hard and meant business. Miriam heard it too, her body going rigid against the stone, her breathing shallow and quick like a trapped animal. "They're coming," she breathed, and Silas saw her eyes dart to his rifle, then back to his face, pleading without words for the kindness of a bullet. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of wounded soldiers who knew the field surgeons would take their legs, in the faces of prisoners who understood what waited for them in Confederate camps. It was the look of someone who'd calculated the mathematics of suffering and found death to be the more merciful equation. But Silas Boone had spent too many nights staring at stars that looked like the eyes of dead men, had carried too many letters home to mothers who would never read them aloud again. He'd become a scout because the mountains didn't judge, because the silence here felt clean compared to the screaming that followed him from battlefield to battlefield. And now this girl, this broken, beautiful girl, was asking him to add her ghost to the collection that already haunted his sleep. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder, and Silas made a choice that would change everything. He lowered his rifle and extended his hand toward her, his voice rough with something that might have been hope. "Not today," he said, the words falling between them like stones thrown into still water. "Today, we run." Miriam stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a snake coiled to strike, her mind struggling to process this deviation from the script she'd written in her head. For weeks, she'd rehearsed this moment, The final moment when someone would grant her the mercy of ending what the Confederate transport camp had begun. She'd imagined it would be quick, clean, a single shot that would silence the voices of the men who'd touched her, who'd whispered promises of what awaited her at the auction blocks in Charleston. But this mountain scout with his weathered face and eyes like winter storms was offering something far more terrifying than death. He was offering her the possibility of tomorrow, and tomorrow was a luxury she'd learned to live without. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking like ice over deep water. "What they did, what they'll do if they catch me again." The words dissolved into silence because some truths were too heavy for language, too sharp for the blunt instrument of speech. She'd been property once, then contraband, then cargo in a wagon train that smelled of fear and unwashed bodies. The Confederate soldiers had treated her like a prize, something valuable enough to keep alive, but disposable enough to break for entertainment. The scars on her wrists told stories she'd never speak aloud, and the bruises on her ribs spelled out words in a language of violence that only other survivors would understand. Silas kept his hand extended, steady as mountain stone, his eyes never leaving her face. "I understand enough," he said, and something in his voice made her look at him, really look at him, for the first time. She saw the way his jaw tightened when the wind carried the sound of men calling to each other in the distance, saw the scars that traced along his knuckles like a map of old battles. This wasn't a man who'd lived an easy life, wasn't someone who offered rescue lightly. He'd seen darkness too, had walked through valleys where hope went to die, and somehow he'd emerged, still willing to extend his hand to a stranger who'd begged him for death. The hoofbeats were closer now, accompanied by voices that made Miriam's skin crawl with recognition. She knew those accents, knew the casual cruelty that lived in their laughter. They'd been hunting her for days, following her trail like bloodhounds, and they wouldn't stop until they'd dragged her back to face whatever punishment awaited escaped property. Her body began to shake, not from cold, but from the memory of hands that had no right to touch, voices that had whispered threats disguised as promises. She closed her eyes and felt herself fragmenting, felt the careful walls she'd built around her sanity beginning to crumble like sand castles before an incoming tide. "Look at me," Silas said, his voice cutting through the spiral of panic that threatened to pull her under. "Look at me, not at them, not at what was. Look at what is." She opened her eyes and found his gaze waiting for her, steady and sure as sunrise. "My name is Silas Boone, and I'm a scout for the Union Army. I know these mountains like my own heartbeat, know every cave and canyon and hidden trail. They're good at hunting, but I'm better at hiding." He paused, listening to the voices growing closer, then looked back at her with something that might have been a smile. "And I've got a powerful dislike for men who hunt women like animals." Miriam felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it existed. It wasn't hope. Hope was too dangerous, too likely to be crushed. But it was something, a spark, a possibility. She looked at his hand again, calloused and scarred but steady as stone, and made a choice that terrified her more than death ever could. She reached out and took it, felt his fingers close around hers with surprising gentleness, and whispered the first words of defiance she'd spoken in months. "My name is Miriam Clark, and I want to live." The cabin held secrets in its weathered walls, stories carved by wind and loneliness that Silas had never shared with another soul. He watched Miriam sleep on his narrow cot, her breathing still shallow but steady, her dark skin finally showing hints of warmth beneath the pallor of exhaustion. The rifle leaned against the doorframe like a silent sentinel, and he found himself checking the horizon every few minutes, searching for dust clouds that might herald the end of this fragile sanctuary. The coffee in his tin cup had grown cold hours ago, but he held it anyway, needing something solid between his hands, while his mind wrestled with the magnitude of what he'd chosen. Every instinct screamed that he should have taken her to the outpost immediately. Let the Union officers decide her fate according to their regulations and paperwork. Instead, he'd brought her here, to this place where he'd hidden from his own ghosts for 2 years, and now her presence filled the silence he'd grown accustomed to with something he couldn't name. When she stirred near dawn, her eyes opened with the wariness of someone who'd learned that consciousness often brought fresh horrors. She looked around the cabin slowly, taking in the rough-hewn furniture, the stack of books beside the fireplace, the careful way everything had its place in this small world he'd built. "You didn't take me to them," she said, and it wasn't a question, but a statement heavy with wonder and confusion. Silas set down his cup and moved to check the bandages on her feet, his movements deliberate and gentle. "Figured you'd had enough of being handed over to folks who think they know what's best for you," he replied, not meeting her eyes. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. She watched his hands work, noting the scars across his knuckles, the way his fingers trembled slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. "Why?" she whispered, and the single word carried the weight of every betrayal she'd endured, every moment when mercy had been withheld. He finished with the bandages before answering, his voice rough with something that might have been shame, or might have been hope. "Because I know what it's like to beg for something and have folks decide you don't deserve it." Ooh, the admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, and Miriam felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the knot of terror that had lived there for so long. She studied his profile in the grey morning light, seeing the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the careful way he held himself, as if expecting a blow that never quite came. "What did you beg for?" she asked, and immediately regretted the question when she saw his jaw tighten. But he didn't turn away, didn't retreat into the silence she'd expected. Instead, he looked at her directly for the first time since she'd awakened, and she saw in his eyes a pain that matched her own. "For my brother to come home from Antietam," he said simply, "for the letters to keep coming, for the war to make sense." The morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, and with it came the reality of their situation. They were two broken people in a broken world, hiding in a place that couldn't shelter them forever. Miriam pushed herself up on her elbows, testing her strength, feeling the pull of healing wounds and the deeper ache of muscles that had forgotten what rest felt like. "They'll come looking," she said, and it wasn't fear in her voice now, but something harder, more determined. Silas nodded, already moving to the window to scan the valley below. "Confederate patrol passed through 3 days ago, asking questions at the trading post. Union boys are getting nervous about raiders this close to the outpost." He turned back to her, and she saw the calculation in his eyes, the way he was already planning routes and contingencies. "We can't stay here much longer." The word "we" settled between them like a promise neither had intended to make, but neither moved to take it back. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, ignoring the protest from her battered body, and stood on unsteady feet. The world tilted slightly, but she gripped the rough wooden post and held on until it steadied. "Then we don't stay," she said, and there was steel in her voice that surprised them both. Silas watched her test her weight on her injured feet, saw the way she bit back a gasp of pain, but didn't sit back down. Something in his chest tightened with what might have been admiration or might have been fear. "You don't understand what's out there," he said quietly. "The mountains, the cold, the men who'd sell you back to the highest bidder without thinking twice." She met his gaze steadily, and he saw in her eyes the same desperate courage that had driven her to escape in the first place. "I understand that staying here means dying slow instead of dying quick," she replied. "And I understand that you could have killed me yesterday and chose not to. That makes you different from every other man I've met in the last year." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and terror in equal measure. Outside, a hawk circled high above the valley, its cry echoing off the canyon walls like a warning or a benediction. Silas felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders, the same weight he'd carried when he'd chosen to leave his unit, when he'd chosen to build this cabin instead of going home to face the empty spaces his brother had left behind. But this choice felt different, heavier and lighter at the same time, because for the first time in 2 years, he wasn't choosing just for himself. "There's a place," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "up in the high country, where the snow stays year-round, and the only folks who go there are the ones running from something bigger than winter." Miriam felt her heart skip, not with fear this time, but with something that might have been hope. "How far?" she asked, and when he answered, 3 days, if we're careful, if we're lucky, she nodded once, sharp and decisive, and said the words that would bind their fates together. "Then we better start being both." They left the cabin before the sun cleared the eastern peaks, moving like shadows through the pine forest that clung to the mountainside with desperate tenacity. Silas had packed light but thorough, hardtack and jerky, ammunition, a bedroll that smelled of wood smoke and solitude, and the small leather pouch that held the last letter from his brother, creased soft from handling. Miriam wore his spare shirt and a pair of trousers he'd cut down to fit her smaller frame, the fabric hanging loose but warm against her skin that had grown accustomed to the bite of mountain air. Her feet, wrapped in strips of cloth and stuffed into boots, too large for her, moved carefully over the rocky ground, each step a negotiation between pain and progress. The silence between them had evolved from wariness to something approaching companionship, though neither would have named it that, both too familiar with the way hope could turn to ash without warning. Behind them, the cabin sat empty and waiting, a monument to the life Silas was leaving behind for the second time in as many years. The trail they followed was barely more than a deer path, winding through stands of aspen whose leaves whispered secrets in the morning breeze. Silas moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to read the mountain's moods, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of pursuit or danger, his rifle held ready but not threatening. Miriam watched him navigate the terrain with something approaching awe, noting how he seemed to know which rocks would hold their weight, which branches would bend without breaking, which shadows offered true concealment and which were merely illusions of safety. "You've done this before," she said during their first rest, settling carefully onto a fallen log while he checked their back trail. He didn't answer immediately, his attention focused on a distant ridge where something had caught his eye, a flash of movement that might have been an elk or might have been something more dangerous. "Running, you mean?" he asked finally, lowering the field glasses he'd pulled from his pack. "Or hiding?" The distinction seemed important to him, though Miriam couldn't quite grasp why. "Both," she said, and watched his mouth tighten into something that wasn't quite a smile. He settled beside her on the log, careful to maintain a respectful distance, and pulled out a piece of jerky that he offered to share. The meat was tough and salty, but it was food, and her body accepted it gratefully. "I ran from Shiloh," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the valley spread out below them like a patchwork quilt of green and gold. "Not from the fighting, from what came after. From the way the officers talked about casualties like they were numbers in a ledger, from the way my captain looked at me when I asked about searching for survivors." His voice carried the weight of old shame, but also something harder, more defiant. "They said my brother was missing, presumed dead, and I should accept it and move on. Said the war was bigger than one man's grief." Miriam felt something twist in her chest, recognizing the particular pain of being told your loss didn't matter, that your suffering was inconvenient to those in power. She reached out without thinking, her fingers brushing against his wrist where it rested on his knee. The contact was brief, barely more than a whisper of touch, but she felt him go still beneath it. "I ran from a plantation in Georgia," she said, her voice steady despite the memories that clawed at her throat. "Not the first time, but the first time I made it past the dogs." The overseer, he had a way of making examples out of the ones who tried to leave, and I watched him break my friend Sarah's spirit so completely she forgot her own name. The words came easier than she'd expected, as if the thin mountain air had stripped away some of the weight they carried. They told me I should be grateful for the food and shelter, that running was ungrateful and sinful. But I knew the difference between shelter and a cage, even if they pretended not to. Silas turned his hand, palm up beneath her fingers, not quite holding her hand but offering the possibility of it, and she felt something in her chest unclench for the first time in months. The afternoon brought clouds that gathered around the peaks like grey wool, promising rain or snow depending on the altitude and the mountain's whims. They climbed steadily, following a switchback trail that seemed to have been carved by water and time rather than human hands. Miriam's breathing grew labored in the thin air, but she pushed forward without complaint, driven by the knowledge that every step took her further from the world that had tried to break her. Silas found himself stealing glances at her profile, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way she favored her left foot but never slowed her pace, the careful way she scanned the terrain as if memorizing escape routes even as they climbed toward what he hoped would be sanctuary. "Tell me about this place we're going," she said, during their third rest, her voice slightly breathless but curious. He pulled out his water bottle and offered it to her first, watching as she drank carefully, rationing even this small comfort. "It's not much," he admitted. "Old mining camp from the gold rush days, mostly played out now. But there's a cabin that's still sound, and a spring that runs year-round. More importantly, it's a place where folks don't ask questions about who you used to be." As the day wore on and the trail grew steeper, they began to encounter patches of snow that had survived the summer in the deep shadows between the rocks. Miriam had never seen snow before, and despite everything, she found herself pausing to touch it, marveling at the way it melted against her warm fingers and left them tingling with cold. Silas watched her wonder with something that might have been tenderness, remembering his own first encounter with mountain snow as a boy, before the war had taught him that beauty and danger often wore the same face. "It's beautiful," she said, and there was surprise in her voice, as if she'd forgotten that the world could contain things that didn't hurt. He nodded, understanding the feeling, remembering how the mountains had seemed like a revelation after the blood-soaked fields of Tennessee. "It can kill you just as easy as anything else," he said, but gently, not wanting to crush her moment of joy. "But yes, it's beautiful. Sometimes I think that's what makes it so dangerous, the way it makes you forget to be careful." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw in his eyes the same hunger for beauty that lived in her own heart, the same desperate need to believe that somewhere in this broken world there were still things worth protecting. The abandoned mining camp materialized from the mist, like something from a half-remembered dream, its weathered buildings clinging to the mountainside with the stubborn persistence of hope, deferred but not destroyed. Silas counted 7 structures still standing: a main cabin with a stone chimney that promised warmth, a smaller building that had once housed supplies, and several lean-tos that had surrendered to time and weather, but still offered the bones of shelter. The silence here was different from the silence of his valley cabin, deeper and more complete, as if the mountain itself had swallowed the echoes of pickaxes and human ambition and left only the whisper of wind through abandoned dreams. Miriam stood beside him at the edge of the camp, her breath visible in the thin air, her eyes taking in this place that might become their sanctuary or their tomb, depending on how well they could disappear into its forgotten embrace. "How long since anyone lived here?" she asked, and her voice seemed small against the vastness of stone and sky that surrounded them. 5 years, maybe 6, Silas replied, shouldering his pack and starting down the narrow path that led between the buildings. Old Pete Garrison was the last one, stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery. Swore there was still gold in these hills, but the mountain took him one winter and nobody came looking. He paused at the door of the main cabin, testing the leather hinges that had somehow survived the weather, and pushed it open with a creak that seemed to echo across decades. Inside, the air was stale but dry, and shafts of afternoon sunlight slanted through gaps in the chinking to illuminate a space that was larger than his valley cabin and infinitely more lonely. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth black with old ashes, and rough-hewn furniture sat arranged as if Pete had just stepped out for a moment and might return at any time. Miriam followed him inside, her footsteps careful on the plank floor, and he watched her take in the details, the tin plates still stacked on a shelf, the faded photograph of a woman pinned to the wall beside the window, the way the silence seemed to press against them like a living thing. "It feels like a church," she said quietly, and Silas understood what she meant. There was something sacred about this place, something that demanded reverence for the dreams that had died here and the solitude that had claimed it. He moved to the fireplace and knelt to examine the flue, testing the drawer and checking for obstructions that might fill the cabin with smoke. "We'll need to be careful about fires," he said, his voice practical but gentle. "Smoke can be seen for miles up here, and there's no telling who might be watching." But even as he spoke, he was already planning how to bank the coals, how to burn only the driest wood during the day when the smoke would dissipate quickly, how to create warmth without advertising their presence to the world below. Miriam nodded, understanding the balance they would need to strike between comfort and survival, between the human need for warmth and the greater need to remain invisible. She moved to the window and looked out at the view that had sustained Pete Garrison through his final years, a vista of peaks and valleys that stretched to the horizon like a frozen sea, beautiful and terrible in its indifference to human suffering. "Do you think he was happy here?" she asked, and Silas joined her at the window, following her gaze across the landscape that had become both prison and paradise for the old prospector. "I think he was free," he said after a long moment. "Maybe that's not the same thing as happy, but maybe it's enough." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of their own choices, their own flight from the world that had tried to define them by their wounds rather than their will to survive. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards and reminding them that winter was coming, that this sanctuary would demand its own price for the shelter it offered. They spent the remaining daylight hours making the cabin habitable, working together with the easy efficiency of people who understood that survival was a shared responsibility. Silas repaired the worst gaps in the chinking, while Miriam swept out the debris of abandonment and arranged their meager supplies on the shelves that Pete had built with his own hands. They found treasures in the forgotten corners, a cache of candles wrapped in oilcloth, a tin of coffee that had somehow escaped the attention of scavenging animals, a deck of cards so worn the faces were barely visible, but still intact. "He left it ready," Miriam observed, running her fingers along the smooth surface of the table where Pete had eaten his solitary meals and planned his futile searches for gold. Like he knew someone would come after him, someone who needed what he'd built. Silas paused in his work, considering this, and felt something shift in his understanding of the old prospector's final years. Perhaps Pete hadn't been waiting for gold at all, but for something more precious, the chance to offer sanctuary to other souls fleeing the cruelties of the world below. As darkness settled over the camp like a familiar blanket, they sat before the small fire Silas had built in the stone hearth, sharing the last of their trail rations and watching the flames dance against the walls that would shelter them through whatever came next. The silence between them had evolved again, becoming something comfortable and companionable, no longer weighted with the desperate urgency of flight, but not yet settled into the rhythm of permanence. "What happens now?" Miriam asked, and the question carried layers of meaning. What happens tomorrow? What happens when winter comes? What happens to two people who have chosen each other over the safety of solitude? Silas poked at the fire with a stick Pete had left beside the hearth, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney like prayers or wishes. "Now we learn to live with ghosts," he said quietly. "Pete's ghost, the ghosts of whoever we used to be before we climbed this mountain. We learn to be the people we choose to be, instead of the people the world tried to make us. Miriam nodded, understanding, and reached across the space between them to take his hand, not in desperation this time, but in something that might have been the beginning of trust, the first tentative step toward whatever they might become together in this place, where forgotten names could be reborn and broken spirits could learn to heal.